In last week's video about siloing in education, I talked about how most of the preschool learning should be interdisciplinary. I also mentioned that at Wildwood Nature School, we do a lot of project-based and inquiry-based learning. So, what exactly does that mean? What are the terms interdisciplinary, project-based, inquiry referring to, and are they interchangeable? Hello, I am Nicole Trevillis-Ravel, and this is Wildwood Teaching. And today I want to unpack the terms interdisciplinary, project-based, and inquiry, talk about where they overlap, how they differ, and most importantly, how they apply to nature-based preschool. Right, first, let's take a look at interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary basically means that you are approaching a topic from multiple angles, multiple subjects, in order to produce a deep understanding of a larger concept. So one example of this is a few winters ago, the children got interested in the footprints that they were making in the snow. And we started looking at kind of the difference between what kind of footprints do we make when we're walking versus running versus jumping. And we decided that we wanted to explore that a little bit more. And so we moved in different ways and we measured the distance between our footprints that we made when we were running versus when we were jumping. We measured how many footprints it took to get from a point A to a point B. Depending on whether we were skipping or whether we were hopping on one foot, right? How many footprints do we get if we are going from the tree to the sand pit? And this is interdisciplinary because we were covering math with our counting and our measuring. We were using gross motor movements to walk or skip or hop or jump or run, and paying attention to what our body was doing and how it was moving through space. When we finished our exploration of footprints, we went back to tracks that animals had made in the snow, and we tried to hypothesize, what was the animal doing? Are these footprints really close together? What direction are they going? What do we think the animal was doing when they made these particular footprints? And so that brought in a bit of a science dimension to it. Now, the goal here was not for us to learn how to use non-standard measurement. The goal was for us to learn about how our bodies move or how animals move. And we had to use our learning about non-standard measurement, right? We had to learn how to use non-standard measurement in order to come at that larger understanding. That is interdisciplinary. Now, inquiry-based learning centers the children and their learning process. It always begins with a question or questions that come from the children, and the process of finding the answers to the questions also relies upon the children's ideas for how can we discover this? What method are we going to use to experiment, to test, to explore, and then we're going to use those discoveries to adjust our ideas and discover and experiment and explore more. So through this method, what you're hoping for is that the children can be curious, that they learn how to think logically and flexibly, right? That they are, in essence, sort of following a scientific method for discovering new things. Inquiries can be short term, they can be long term. One inquiry can kind of logically lead to another, right? So our snow question was a very short term inquiry. And once the snow went away, right, we didn't have uh, anything else, right, to move along with that. Um, and this question about it came from what the children were noticing about the tracks that they found in the snow. We've also done longer term inquiries. So, for example, one year children had a question, where do colors come from? And so this inquiry process, um, involved us creating pieces and milestones along the way, right? What are we going to think about first when we are thinking about colors? So in other words, we might play with flashlights and learn all we can about light and all of those discoveries. We might play with color mixing and color wheels and take notes. What colors are we creating and how are we creating that? So where does that color come from? It might involve a little bit of making natural dyes. Right? What can we use from nature? Where does color come from within nature? Right? And so again, this could be interdisciplinary, like it was with our color mixing that probably involves art and science and maybe some direction following and some reading and some literacy, right? If we're taking our notes while we are in whatever logical way we are doing, that could be writing or it could be an emergent pre-writing activity. But inquiries don't necessarily have to be interdisciplinary. And so when I was teaching a combined kindergarten first grade one year, we did a punctuation inquiry, right? To learn how writers use exclamation points or periods or question marks. And so this was really specifically about literacy and writing. But the inquiry came from the children, right? How do we use this in our own writing? And all of our little questions came from the children and the ideas, right? How are we going to do this? Right? So we had a whole bunch of shared text, big books, right? That most of the children knew how to read because it was something that we did as a class. And so they decided they were going to get into small groups and investigate, right? And they were going to do things like think about where does the punctuation happen on the page? How many periods are on each page? So I guess, yes, there's a little bit of math and counting in there. Like I said in last week's, it's very difficult to completely silo education, right? Or does every page even have a period on it? What are the words that come before an exclamation point? And so this was really focused simply on that one topic. Now, project-based learning shares, obviously, some things with interdisciplinary, with inquiry, but the biggest difference is that there is an end goal. Inquiries can go on and on and on forever, and they can lead to something and lead to something else. But project-based learning has an end goal in mind, which is the project that you want to produce, which very often is in response to solving a real world problem. And now, like I said, this certainly could be interdisciplinary, and your inquiry could lead to an end product. But here, the emphasis really is on product versus process, right? You're not necessarily focused on your learning goals all along the way. You want to get that product produced. Everything else is collateral, right? It's a consequence of that project. Um, and so several years ago, my preschoolers wrote and produced a short play. Now, it came about as a gradual morphing from an inquiry, started as an inquiry about the sun. The children had asked a question, what makes the sun? And, unfortunately, that's not the most hands-on preschool topic, right? You can't really explore the sun by touching it or manipulating it in any way. So yes, we did read nonfiction texts about how stars are formed and what they are made of. And we talked about gases and heat and energy. And we moved along. But as we moved through our inquiry, it became clear that what the children really wanted to know was, how did the sun get up in the sky? And yes, again, we did a cursory read through explaining that stars are formed when a nebula or a dead star, right, leaves matter floating around, and that matter collapses and condenses into a dense ball of floating molecules. Um, and that is what a star is made of. And that is very difficult for preschoolers to understand. In fact, I'm not completely sure I've wrapped my head around that concept. So I came up with the idea, wouldn't it be cool if we did a study of pourquoi stories about the sun? Now, pourquoi story is basically a catch-all phrase for myths and legends and traditional stories that explain something that is hard to explain. Now, the question came from the children, but really the idea of how we were going to explore the question came from me. So that pulls it out of that inquiry process. And so we studied these pourquoi stories from all over the world. Also, right here, Indigenous tales local to our area, exploring the question, how did the sun get up into the sky? And, we got all of these different ideas about how it might have gotten there. And as their final project in this project-based learning, again, this idea was floated by me. We do every year at our moving up ceremony. The children have something that comes from them. They have a piece of the ceremony that they do. This has taken so many different forms throughout the year. They have done art, like an art museum, right, where they've displayed their artwork that they did in that final half of the year. We have done songs. This year they are writing the songs. We have done dramatic retellings of different stories, like A House for Hermit Crab. We have done sign language displays or performances. And so for this particular year, I asked the children. I mean, they certainly could have said no. He said, we have read all of these stories about how the sun gets up into the sky. Is there a question that you would like to write your own pretend story about? And they did write a story about why why the trees lose their leaves in the winter. And we ended up turning that into a play, and that became our performance at the end of the year. And that was our final project in this project based learning activity. So, as you can see, there's absolutely overlap among project-based, interdisciplinary, and inquiry-based learning. And all of them are child-centered methods. All of them aim to make learning relevant by tapping into the children's interests and capabilities. And all of them require hands-on learning and problem solving. The benefits of doing this type of learning include developing creativity and curiosity in children, increasing their engagement with material, and developing skills through meaning and application rather than, a flashcard type of question and answer activity. So, have you used any of these methods in your preschool teaching? How have you used them? How has it worked for you? I would love to hear about it. You can comment on this video in the comment section. You can send me a note through the weekly newsletter. You can get in touch with me through Instagram or Facebook. I really am interested in any type of inquiry, interdisciplinary, project-based learning you've done and how it turned out for you. And then next week, I will be looking at rocks and thinking about rocks as a loose part and how you can use them to enhance your preschool curriculum. I will see you there.